It's a salute to America, and I'm going to be here, and I'm going to say a few words, and we're going to have planes going overhead, the best fighter jets in the world, and other planes too. And we're going to have some tanks stationed outside. Got to be pretty careful with the tanks because the roads have a tendency not to like to carry heavy tanks, so we have to put them in certain areas. But we have the brand new Sherman tanks, so we have the brand new Abram tanks.
It's like a laugh track here with Michael Steele on set. So just like meeting with Kim Jong-un on North Korean Seoul, it's a wonder no one ever thought of it before, right? I mean, on 4th of July, a big speech at the Lincoln Memorial, fighter jets flying overhead, military tanks everywhere, half an hour of fireworks. In addition to accusations that Trump is politicizing what should be patriotic, the Washington Post says this about his 4th of July celebration, quote, "The Defense Department has not released any estimates of how much the celebration could cost, but the use of numerous aircraft could drive it well into the millions of dollars when counting fuel and maintenance. The F-35 costs $30,000 per hour to fly. That's according to Pentagon estimates. Each Blue Angel jet costs at least $10,000 per hour to operate, and the cost of flying an Air Force One jet is more than $140,000 an hour." Michael Steele, as punishment for giggling, you have to go first.
Okay, so the reason our roads in the city I grew up in aren't built for tanks is that we don't roll tanks down Constitution Avenue or Pennsylvania Avenue or New York Avenue or any street in the city. We are not a militarized zone. We've never had to prove our patriotism by rolling out planes and tanks. This is for the president's own self-aggrandized amusement. He went to a Bastille celebration a year or 2 years ago and fell in love with the idea. He's been feted by Kim Jong-un and others who have rolled out all of these military hardware to show their masculinity. That's not how our president does it. And so as a native Washingtonian, I find this to be offensive. I don't need a tank in my front lawn to tell my neighbor I'm a patriot. What I need to do is to celebrate, as we always have, and remember those who have come before us and celebrate the history and the legacy of this country, as messed up as it is at times, right? And I just find this whole thing to be problematic, let alone just the personal grinding that it causes when I think about what this is really about. And this is not saluting America, it's saluting Trump.
And can I just, you mentioned, France and Kim Jong-un, who, Donald Trump greatly admires Kim Jong-un. He sort of aspires to be sort of a mini, Putin or Kim Jong-un. He wants to be have that kind of absolute power. He claims Kim Jong-un's people just adore him. Well, they have no choice because he'd throw them in a gulag and probably kill them. But you think about the Bastille Day celebration. What is that celebration about? What is the message that's meant to be sent by the military armada that's rolling down the streets of Paris? It's a message to tyrants. What Bastille Day represents is the victory over tyrannical rule, over the king, and over the attempt for the king to return. The storming of the Bastille was about victory over tyrants. What is the message when Kim Jong-un rolls tanks down the streets of his capital? The message is to democracies. It's the messages to people like us, to Western democracies. You better be careful because we, the unified North Korean people, will defeat you. We have nukes. Be afraid of us. So what is the message Donald Trump is trying to send by rolling tanks down Constitution Avenue? Who is that message to? It's certainly not to tyrants because he likes tyrants. He loves tyrants. It's not to Putin. It's not to Kim Jong-un. It's not to the Saudis. Is it to our friends? Is it to Western democracies who he doesn't particularly like? Or is it to us? Is it to the resistance in this country? I got tanks. I have this military armada. The message is a threat. But it's always a threat when you roll out your military. But it's to whom is the threat? And I suspect that the threat is to his fellow Americans. And I hate to say that, but I think that Donald Trump styles himself a tyrant, not a defeater of tyrants.
By the way, in the fact correction department, the U.S. military hasn't used Sherman tanks for 7 years.
I know. But it's like, I thought of that too. He's like in the new Shermans. It's like, no.
If they were. But the thing is, the message, by the way, of July 4th is also against tyranny, right? I mean, these people pledge their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor to rebel against a tyrant, to rebel against hereditary privilege, which he seems to embrace. And by the way, if you play that game, if you took Donald Trump back to the 18th century, would he be a rebel or would he be a loyalist? he would be a loyalist.
100%.
Everybody in his family would be a loyalist.
That's
they would
right.
all be supporting the king and the crown.
Except they wouldn't fight because none of them actually
Exactly.
had the gallantry.
Because they wouldn't risk their
They'd
fortune.
let someone
They'd
else
be
do it.
birthers, but we'll figure that one out without mean another
Yeah,
day.
look, this is what third world dictators do. At the end of the day, this is going to cost American taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. We were just talking about detention centers and how kids were being treated, and the government saying that, hey, you know what, we can't give them toothpaste or soap, and we're going to do this. Flint doesn't have clean drinking water. I mean, there's so many other problems, but yet we need to salute Donald Trump, or he wants to be saluted on 4th of July. We are so backwards right now, and I just don't know how we get out of it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.